The world was shaken when reports began to circulate that over 2,800 Israeli homes had been destroyed in a sudden and coordinated wave of attacks, eerily reminiscent of the destruction long associated with Palestinian neighborhoods. What made the event even more shocking was that it was not carried out by a single faction but was the result of an unprecedented joint military operation by Egypt and Iran. For decades, these nations had expressed discontent with Israel's policies and actions, but rarely, if ever, had they coordinated in such a direct and devastating strike. The event marked a new chapter in the already fragile Middle Eastern balance, and it was clear from the very beginning that nothing would remain the same afterward. The attacks began in the early hours of the morning. Israeli civilians in towns close to the southern border woke up to the distant sound of fighter jets slicing through the night sky, followed by a series of explosions that lit up the horizon. Within moments, neighborhoods once filled with families, children, and the routines of daily life were reduced to rubble. The scale of the destruction was something Israel had not experienced in decades, not since the Great Wars of the 20th century. Entire blocks were leveled. Streets were ripped open. Electricity grids collapsed, plunging entire areas into darkness. Fires burned uncontrollably, and the cries of survivors echoed across the devastated towns. What unsettled many was the precision of the strikes. Egyptian and Iranian forces seemed to have mapped out their targets with frightening accuracy. Intelligence analysts later revealed that the operation was months, if not years, in the making. Communication lines were intercepted, drone surveillance was employed, and sleeper agents within Israel had quietly identified weak points. The goal was not random destruction but to send a message: the suffering of Palestinians would no longer remain one-sided. For the first time in generations, Israelis experienced a level of devastation that mirrored what had been endured across Gaza and the West Bank. Eyewitness accounts painted harrowing pictures. Mothers clutched their children as buildings collapsed around them. Men scrambled to pull loved ones from beneath the debris. In some neighborhoods, entire families were buried alive under the ruins of their own homes. Hospitals, already strained, became scenes of chaos as doctors and nurses rushed to treat thousands of wounded, many of them badly burned or suffering from broken bones. Medical supplies quickly ran out, and blood banks were depleted within hours. Volunteers lined up to donate, but the need far outweighed the resources. As the dust settled, the international community reacted with disbelief. The United Nations held an emergency session where delegates from across the world condemned the scale of the violence. Yet, as always, the chamber was divided. Some nations argued that Israel was finally tasting its own medicine, that years of occupation and bombardment against Palestinians had culminated in a backlash that could no longer be contained. Others called the joint attacks an act of terrorism, a blatant violation of international law, and a threat to global stability. The United States swiftly declared its support for Israel, pledging military and financial assistance, while Russia and China remained cautious, watching the unfolding drama as an opportunity to reshape regional influence. Meanwhile, in Cairo and Tehran, governments hailed the operation as a success. Egyptian state television broadcasted images of fighter pilots returning to their bases as heroes, greeted with flowers and chants of victory. In Iran, massive crowds poured into the streets, waving flags and celebrating what they saw as a long-overdue act of resistance against a regional adversary. Leaders from both nations declared that their actions were not against the Israeli people but against the policies of their government. Yet, the images of flattened homes and blooded civilians told a different story. For the average Israeli citizen, the nuance of political speeches meant little in the face of personal loss. The psychological impact of the attacks was equally profound. Israelis, who had long felt protected by one of the most advanced defense systems in the world, suddenly realized their vulnerability. The famed Iron Dome had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume and coordination of missiles launched simultaneously from multiple fronts. Many questioned how their government, known for its intelligence networks and military superiority, had failed to anticipate such a massive assault. Protests broke out in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, with citizens demanding accountability from their leaders. Some even called for an end to aggressive policies in Palestinian territories, arguing that the cycle of violence had spiraled out of control. Palestinians, on the other hand, watched the events unfold with a mixture of sorrow and vindication. 4 years, they had pleaded with the world to recognize their suffering, to acknowledge the pain of losing homes, families, and futures. Now, for the first time, the destruction was mirrored across the border. Many expressed no joy at the sight of civilians suffering but saw it as a tragic reflection of their own history. Maybe now, one Palestinian elder was quoted saying, "They will understand what it feels like to live under constant fear, to lose everything in a single night." In the days that followed, humanitarian organizations rushed to provide aid. Convoys carrying food, water, and medical supplies were dispatched, but Israel's government initially resisted outside help, determined to show resilience. Eventually, as the scope of the disaster became undeniable, international aid agencies were allowed in. Camps were set up for those left homeless, and volunteers from around the world arrived to assist in rebuilding efforts. Yet, the scars, both physical and emotional, would take generations to heal. Strategically, the attacks altered the geopolitical map. Israel responded with limited retaliatory strikes, but careful restraint was exercised, wary of escalating into a full-scale war with two powerful neighbors simultaneously. Diplomatic backchannels opened, with Turkey, Qatar, and European nations attempting to mediate a ceasefire and prevent further bloodshed. Still, the precedent had been set. Israel was no longer untouchable, and alliances against it could materialize in unexpected forms. For the families who lost everything, however, politics held little meaning. A father who had spent years building his home now stood in front of a pile of rubble, unable to comprehend the loss. A young boy sat silently beside his injured mother in a hospital corridor, his wide eyes reflecting the trauma of a childhood shattered in a single night. Communities once filled with life and laughter were now ghost towns, marked by silence, smoke, and the faint smell of burning wood and stone. The destruction of 2,800 homes was not just a number. It represented lives uprooted, dreams erased, and futures rewritten. It was a reminder that wars do not end when the bombs stop falling. They continue in the grief of survivors, in the rebuilding of broken walls, and in the haunting memories carried forward. And though the attacks would fade from international headlines with time, for those who lived through them, the night of fire and thunder would never be forgotten.